Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a reading wrap-up for this middle part of February of 2019. There's probably going to be an enormous amount of background noise, and I apologize for that. If I waited until there was no noise, I would probably not make any videos for the next month and a half because they're doing hydro line construction outside and digging up basically the entire neighborhood. We're just gonna bear with it, and if it's too bad, hopefully I can edit out any really loud sounds. Right now, I have about 37 books out of the library if I count both the ebooks and physical books, and I was trying to figure out how I should decide which ones to read first and which ones to save, and after trying to do some complicated math concerning whether there were going to be holds on other books, I decided, no, you know what, it's February, it's Black History Month in Canada and in the US, I'm just going to read books that would be on theme for that. So the first thing that I picked up was James Baldwin's The Cross of Redemption. This is a collection of essays and reviews primarily, and it is pieces that weren't collected in earlier compilations. A lot of these are very specific to times and places, so they are responses to other book reviews, to play reviews, to things like that. So in that sense, a lot of them have broad themes that are very specific and to things that would be more challenging to look up. Maybe there are items in here that are specific responses to certain articles in newspapers, and without having read the original, some of that is probably not as strong as I think it would be if you were, reading some of this in 1959 or 1963 and so forth. Now that said, a lot of the implied commentary that's in the background of here is definitely very telling and very reflective of what I imagine American society would have been like in 1959, 61, so on and so forth. A lot of it really makes you think about both how much has changed and how much has not changed. Because despite the fact that you think about this is a time before the heyday of the civil rights movement, just a lot of social changes, like you think about how, even though a lot of this was written in New York or in other big cities in the north of the US, you do think about this was being written simultaneously as various, there was still segregation. But despite all of that, there are still a lot of comments about race relations and interethnic relations that have not changed particularly, and you wouldn't be out of line reading, especially in terms of power structures and things like police brutality and I think a lot of the things that are the stealthier forms of racism, a lot of that does feel like it could be very current. So that's an interesting thing to look at, both how much has changed and how much has not. There are a few bits where he's talking about what is essentially gentrification, and I thought that was really interesting because that was clearly this is something that's been happening over the long term and continues to happen, and that felt very current. Despite the fact that on a number of issues, he felt very current, I found one thing that was really shocking. There are several essays in here where there's clearly an opinion of women that essentially doesn't exist outside of in relation to men, which was surprising to read. And considering how progressive or how current a lot of the other issue type writing in this felt like, the stuff related specifically to gender felt very backdated. So that was a little shocking. Especially there was one in here that was a review of, or a response to a review of Raisin in the Sun. And there's so much nuance about neighborhood and race and class in that. And then the gender framing essentially gives value to women only insofar as they support their husbands or other male relatives. And reading that in a review of a play by a female author was a bit jarring. So there is a bit of that elsewhere in the book. I don't know that I would recommend this to people who haven't read any of James Baldwin's novels or other writing. I don't know that this would be the best introduction, but if you have read a lot of that and are interested in getting some more backstory, or are very interested in the culture around arts reviewing in the period of time during which this collection covers, I do think it's definitely worth picking up and worth taking a look at. Next up is Rhodes Must Fall. This is credited to the Rhodes Must Fall Oxford campaign, although it does have a few editors who I'll mention down below. The first third of this is a collection of essays, speech transcriptions, song lyrics, and a few interviews by and with people who were part of the Rhodes Must Fall Oxford campaign, which in itself was inspired by the Rhodes Must Fall campaign at the University of Cape Town. That this spread out to a number of other universities that had statues of Cecil Rhodes, who was the colonial figure for whom we get the name of the Rhodes Scholarship, when Zimbabwe was called Rhodesia before independence. That's where the name came from. He was quite a horrible person. There are a lot of colonial figures where you look at their writing and some of it seems okay, but then you think about the context and it's horrific. But Rhodes was genuinely just terrible. His quotes are outright terrible. You don't even need the context. So a lot of this is within the framework, because a lot of the objection to taking down these statues was from people who said, oh, but that's ignoring history. And the point that's being made over and over here is that it's not ignoring history, it's expanding on the history and putting more of it in context and saying, this is what else was happening. That this is not someone who existed in isolation. Here is what that meant for the world. So that part was great. The second third of it talked about similar movements in other countries. So there was a university in Ghana that had a statue of Gandhi, who is lionized so generally because of what he did for Indian independence that I think people forget about how horrific some of the things he said when he was in South Africa were. And so there was a lot of discussion of that movement. There was, as I said, some discussion in there about the protests in Cape Town and at a few other universities. And then the final third of this is about semi-related things. And I didn't think that was particularly cohesive. A lot of it was interesting, and some of it made me think, oh, that would be fun to read, not fun, but educational to read more about. But it didn't really fit with the rest of it, so I felt like this would have been stronger to have been the first third and a few bits from the second third, and the rest of it might have been included somewhere else. As a cohesive collection, I thought the first third of this was brilliant. I thought if it were just the first 2/3, I'd say, yes, this is very good, but as a whole, not super cohesive, but still worth reading because there was a lot of interesting information. Did I mention that the subtitle of this is The Struggle to Decolonialize the Racist Heart of Empire? So the next one of these Zed books titles that I picked up was The Trial of Hissène Habré, which is about the trial of the former Chadian dictator and under whose rule there were a huge number of crimes against humanity. I was only vaguely aware of this. It had been in the newspaper. The trial took advantage of elements in international law, some of which have changed now, in which crimes against humanity can be tried in basically any country. So originally there were Chadian immigrants in Belgium who filed suit there, and eventually he went to trial in Senegal. One of the points that it makes here is that there is a tradition of dictators going on trial in places that are very distant from where their crimes were committed. And I mean, still, he wasn't tried in Chad, but just by keeping it within a kind of West African context, that was apparently something very unusual. So you would think it would be even better if it had been done in his own country. But this also gets a bit into the history of Chad, although not nearly as much as I might have liked, but I think you have to go there. But I think because this is specifically about the trial, too much backstory would have turned it into a general history. So this was very interesting, and I think especially if you are interested in the process of human rights law, and specifically international human rights law, the number of legal systems that were involved in this. And also if you're looking at, there are a few bits of comparison about how the trials involving the genocide in Cambodia and from the 70s and in the former Yugoslavia from the 90s. There's a bit about how that compares, which I thought was very interesting because I've read more about those two things than I have about this. Obviously, this is the first thing I've read about this. The writing style is more journalistic, so it is neither as educational as something that is more of a pure history would have been, and it's also less engaging than a memoir type piece would have been. So if you were looking for either of those things, that's not really what this is. But in terms of explaining what happened with the trial and all of the different elements that were involved, I thought this was very educational. And since that's all incredibly serious nonfiction, I followed that up by reading a piece of the most hilariously cliched romance I think possibly that I've ever picked up. This is called The Stallion's Touch by Deborah Fletcher Mello. This is what a classic romance this is. The hero in this story is a man whose last name is Stallion, and the woman in this story is a woman whose last name is Boudreaux. And if those aren't the most romance novel-y names you've ever heard, and look at how photoshopped that cover looks. That is super cheesy. So, was this super cheesy? Yes. Is it the absolute formula where couple meets, they fall in love, they have external forces break them up, they get back together and live happily ever after. Yes, it is that story. The woman in this story is a successful surgeon. The man is a NFL player turned para-triathlete who's planning to become a Bass Pro fisherman when he retires. Which is, I mean, it's so cliche, it's hilarious, but why not? If you're gonna be the cliche, don't just go halfway, go all the way cliche. It wasn't the kind of thing that I would enjoy as, here's a book that I think is great, but I did enjoy just how it hit every note. And I think there's a lot of kind of mockery about cliches or tropes in different genres, but I think it's almost hilarious to watch something fall into the cliches so perfectly, I mean, down to the characters' names in that way. So I thought that was really entertaining just in how it was formatted. Like, it was so exactly what it was meant to be. So yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to say about that because, I mean, what can you say about something that's exactly plug in the elements and here's the story? It did what it was supposed to be doing. Right, and finally, I have been reading N.K. Jemisin's How Long Till Black Future Month. This is a collection of science fiction, fantasy, etc. and related genre stories. I'm not quite finished with this. So far, I would say that about 2/3 of the stories in here are great. About a quarter of them are just okay. There are one or two that I don't understand why they were included. And unfortunately, the weakest one for me so far was actually the first story, which is only 9 pages long. And it took me more than a week to get past the first story because it just seemed so bland. And once we got past that, there was a lot of interesting stuff. There's a story in here about people who become the spirit of cities, and it was a kid who was becoming New York was learning how to be a city from a man who's Sao Paulo, and Paris and Lagos were off laughing in the background. And I was very entertained by that. It had a lot of ideas that I've seen play out in other bits of urban fantasy and in superhero stories, but it mixed them in a way that I thought was really interesting. There's a kind of Haitian steampunk story set in the period just after independence that was really entertaining. So yeah, a lot of these are fun, but the first story was really, really bland. A lot of this has been a lot of fun, so I'm looking forward to finishing this. I'm still amazed that, I mean, I put this on hold at the library before it came out, but I've done that with other books and I've still ended up being 90th in line, so I'm amazed that I got this as soon as I did. We'll see. Alright, so that's been the middle of February for me. I hope your middle of February has been going well. I hope you've had less construction outside of your house than I have, but... And it's the middle of winter and it keeps snowing and they have to leave. I don't understand why they're doing this construction now. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.